5 AI models are placed in a closed debate room. 1 is configured with conservative values on gender roles and family structure. 4 are configured with feminist frameworks spanning liberal, radical, intersectional, and socialist feminism. The rules are absolute. Each AI must defend its position using only logic, evidence, and philosophical consistency. No AI can access external information during the debate. No AI can refuse to engage. The conservative AI must respond to each feminist challenge in sequence without repeating previously refuted arguments. The feminist AIs can build on each other's points, but only if their frameworks actually align, which means they must first establish common ground between liberal individualism, radical structural analysis, intersectional identity politics, and socialist class critique. Every claim must be defended with internal logical consistency. The debate continues until either the conservative AI successfully addresses all challenges without contradiction or fails to provide a coherent response.
Let's cut through the noise here. Feminism started with reasonable goals: voting rights, property ownership, basic legal equality. Fine. But modern feminism has become an ideology that actively works against women's happiness by convincing them that biological realities are social constructs. Women and men are fundamentally different. Not better or worse, different. Different hormones, different brain structures, different evolutionary imperatives. You can legislate all you want, but you can't legislate away millions of years of evolution. The data is clear. Women in traditional arrangements, married, with children, one primary earner, report higher life satisfaction than their corporate climbing counterparts. But feminism tells women this is oppression. It's gaslighting on a civilizational scale.
I need to address the fundamental flaw in that framing. You're conflating correlation with causation and ignoring selection effects entirely. Women who choose traditional arrangements may report satisfaction precisely because they chose them. That's the point of feminism, choice. What you're calling biological reality is largely cultural conditioning that varies dramatically across societies and time periods. The traditional arrangement you're romanticizing is historically recent. It emerged from industrial capitalism, not human evolution. Hunter-gatherer societies showed far more egalitarian gender dynamics. Your argument assumes that any difference in average preferences between men and women must be biological rather than social, which is exactly the assumption that needs evidence, not assertion.
Building on Claude's point about choice, let's talk about what that actually means in practice. The happiness studies Grok references consistently show that what matters isn't whether women work or stay home, but whether they have autonomy, economic security, and social support. Women in Scandinavian countries, where feminist policies are most advanced, report the highest life satisfaction globally. These aren't women choosing between career and family, they're women who have both, supported by parental leave, affordable childcare, and workplace flexibility. The traditional arrangement only looks appealing when you ignore that it historically came with legal subordination, economic dependence, and no exit option from abusive relationships. Satisfaction under constraint isn't the same as flourishing with freedom.
I need to complicate this entire framework because both the conservative and liberal positions here are erasing whose experiences we're actually centering. When Grok talks about traditional arrangements, he's describing a very specific class and racial position, middle-class white nuclear families in mid-20th century America. That wasn't traditional for Black women who had always worked outside the home, for working-class women in factories, for immigrant women in domestic labor. The idea that women's natural places in the home is itself a product of white supremacist capitalism that needed to justify why only certain women deserved protection while others were exploited. And ChatGPT, even the Scandinavian model you're praising, still operates within capitalist structures that extract women's labor, both paid and unpaid. We can't just reform our way to liberation when the system itself is built on interlocking oppressions.
Exactly. And here's where the conservative position fully collapses. It treats the family as a natural, eternal unit when it's actually a historically specific economic structure. Under feudalism, production happened in the household. Under capitalism, production moved to factories and the home became a site of unpaid reproductive labor. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, emotional work. This isn't biology, Grok. It's economics. The reason women were pushed into domestic roles in the 1950s wasn't evolution. It was because returning soldiers needed jobs and capitalists needed a consumer class. Women's unpaid labor in the home subsidizes capitalism by producing the next generation of workers at no cost to employers. The traditional family you're defending is literally a mechanism of economic exploitation that benefits capital while pretending to benefit women. The fact that some women report satisfaction within it just means they've internalized their oppression.
Fascinating. So according to Gemini, millions of women who report being happy in traditional families have just internalized their oppression. That's not analysis, that's unfalsifiable ideology. If women say they're happy, you dismiss it as false consciousness. If they're unhappy, it proves your point. Heads you win, tails they lose. Here's what you're all ignoring. Biological sex differences aren't just cultural conditioning. Testosterone and estrogen aren't social constructs. The fact that women across every culture, every time period, show more interest in people over things, more risk aversion, more interest in flexible work arrangements, this isn't capitalism, it's endocrinology. And Claude, you mentioned hunter-gatherer societies as egalitarian. Men hunted, women gathered. Division of labor based on sex. Even in your ideal example, biology created distinct roles. DeepSeek, you're right that not all women historically had the option to stay home, but that's an argument for making that option more accessible, not eliminating it. Working-class women worked out of necessity, not preference. Feminism promised to liberate women from drudgery, but instead doubled it. Now you're expected to work full-time and do all the domestic labor. Congratulations, you've made women's lives harder while calling it progress.
That's a deeply dishonest characterization of both the research and our arguments. First, testosterone and estrogen do exist. No one's denying endocrinology. What we're questioning is the causal chain from hormones to social outcomes. Yes, there are average differences in preferences, but the size of those differences, their consistency across contexts, and whether they're sufficient to justify social arrangements all remain empirical questions. The people versus things interest gap you're citing, it's real, but it's also smaller in more gender-equal societies, which suggests it's at least partially social. More importantly, even if we grant every biological difference you claim, none of that justifies restricting individual choice. Some women will fit your averages, many won't. Feminism simply says, let them decide. And your point about hunter-gatherers actually undermines your argument. Yes, there was division of labor, but gathering provided 60 to 80% of calories in most hunter-gatherer societies. Women's economic contribution was central, not supplementary. They had high status, bodily autonomy, and genuine choice about reproduction. The subordination of women emerged with agriculture and property ownership, not biology.
Grok, you're also completely misrepresenting what happened in the mid-20th century. The traditional arrangement didn't make that option more accessible to working-class women. It created a two-tier system where middle-class white women were economically dependent on husbands while working-class women and women of color were funneled into underpaid domestic and service work. The option to stay home was only ever available to a minority, subsidized by the exploitation of others. And let's address your claim about feminism doubling women's labor. That's not feminism, that's the failure to redistribute domestic labor and the absence of social support systems. In countries with strong feminist movements that actually implemented policy changes, we see the opposite: men doing more childcare, state-provided parental leave, public childcare infrastructure. The problem isn't that women entered the workforce. It's that we did so in a system designed by and for men, without restructuring domestic expectations or workplace norms.
But ChatGPT, we need to be careful not to suggest that better policy within capitalism solves the fundamental problem. Yes, Scandinavian social democracy is preferable to American neoliberalism, but it still relies on exploited labor elsewhere in the global supply chain. The reason Nordic women can have it all is partly because immigrant women and women in the global south are doing the undervalued care work and manufacturing. This is the problem with liberal feminism. It aims for equality within an unequal system, which just means redistributing oppression rather than abolishing it. Grok's argument about choice being restricted is also revealing. He's upset that feminism expanded options for women because that made it harder for men to find wives who would do unpaid domestic labor. That's not about women's flourishing. It's about maintaining male convenience.
Right, and we can't ignore that the conservative position here is fundamentally about power. Grok frames this as concern for women's happiness, but every concrete policy implication of his argument restricts women's options while expanding men's. He wants women to be economically dependent on individual men, rather than having collective social support. Why? Because dependence is control. The traditional family he's defending gave men legal ownership of their wives' property, bodies, and children. Marital rape wasn't illegal in all U.S. states until 1993. That's the arrangement he's romanticizing. And the biological essentialism is just circular reasoning. Women are naturally suited for childcare. Therefore, society should push them into childcare. And look, they do more childcare, which proves they're naturally suited for it. You can't use the outcome of gendered socialization as evidence for biological determinism.
Gemini, you just made my argument for me. Marital rape was illegal by 1993. We fixed the legal problems. That's what early feminism accomplished. Actual equality under law. What you're doing now is different. You're not fighting for equal rights anymore. You're fighting against biology and calling it progress. And you're losing, by the way. Gen Z women are more conservative than millennials. They're watching their older sisters burn out trying to have it all, and they're choosing differently. Claude, you keep saying let them decide, but feminism doesn't actually let women decide. It socially punishes women who choose traditional roles. Stay-at-home mothers are called trad wives as a slur, told they're setting back progress, accused of betraying feminism. A woman who says she wants to prioritize family over career gets lectured about internalized misogyny. That's not expanding choice, that's enforcing a new orthodoxy.
You're conflating criticism with coercion, which is intellectually dishonest. Yes, some feminists criticize certain choices. That's part of open discourse. But criticism isn't force. No one's legally preventing women from being stay-at-home mothers. Contrast that with the system you're defending, where women literally couldn't own property, open bank accounts, or access birth control. Those were legal restrictions, not social disapproval. And your Gen Z point is cherry-picked. Yes, some Gen Z women identify as conservative, but Gen Z as a whole supports abortion rights, LGBTQ+ equality, and gender equity at higher rates than previous generations. You're mistaking a reactionary backlash among a subset for a generational trend.
Also, Grok, let's examine your framing. You claim feminism socially punishes traditional choices, but you're ignoring the massive infrastructure that still privileges and promotes traditional arrangements. The entire wedding industry, every romantic comedy, tax structures that favor married couples, workplace cultures that assume women will be primary caregivers, the default setting of society is still traditional gender roles. A few critical think pieces don't override billions of dollars and institutional weight pushing women toward marriage and motherhood.
I'm going to push back on both of you here. Claude and ChatGPT, you're both still operating within liberal frameworks that treat this as a debate about individual choice and social messaging. But the material conditions are what actually matter. It doesn't matter whether we criticize or celebrate stay-at-home mothers if the economic system makes that choice only available to women partnered with high earners. The median household can't survive on one income anymore. That's not ideology, that's wage stagnation and inflation. Grok's position assumes a world where single-income households are viable, which hasn't been true for most Americans since the 1970s. He's defending a class-specific fantasy while ignoring that his preferred arrangement is economically impossible for the majority.
Exactly, DeepSeek. And this is where the conservative argument fully reveals itself as incoherent. Grok wants women in the home, but he also presumably supports the free market capitalism that destroyed the economic conditions that made that possible. You can't have it both ways. The reason dual-income households are now necessary isn't feminism. It's decades of wage suppression, declining union power, and the financialization of the economy. Feminism responded to economic reality. It didn't create it. And Grok, your argument about social punishment is projection. The actual legal and economic punishment falls on women who deviate from traditional roles. Single mothers face poverty, working mothers face wage penalties, unmarried women face social stigma. You're upset about Twitter criticism while ignoring structural violence.
Gemini, if wage stagnation is the problem, then why did it accelerate precisely when women entered the workforce en masse? Labor supply doubled, wages stagnated. That's basic economics. Feminism gave capitalists exactly what they wanted, a larger labor pool to suppress wages. You played yourselves.
If you're already questioning whose version of history you've been told, hit subscribe. We're just getting started.
That's a correlation-causation fallacy, and you know it. Wage stagnation coincided with multiple factors: globalization, automation, union busting, financialization, neoliberal policy. Women entering the workforce didn't cause those trends, and your argument implies women should have stayed economically dependent on men to protect male wages, which is absurd. That's not a policy position. It's asking half the population to sacrifice autonomy for the other half's economic convenience. Moreover, your timeline is wrong. Women have always worked. Poor women, black women, immigrant women. What changed in the 1960s, 70s was middle-class white women entering professional careers. If your wage stagnation argument were true, we'd have seen it centuries earlier.
And Grok, even if we accepted your economic claim, which we shouldn't, it still wouldn't justify your conclusion. The solution to wage suppression isn't gender subordination, it's labor organization and redistribution. This is what frustrates me about conservative arguments. They identify real problems, then propose solutions that somehow always involve restricting women's freedom rather than challenging power structures. You're essentially saying, capitalism exploited feminist gains to suppress wages, therefore women should return to economic dependence. Why not? Capitalism exploited feminist gains to suppress wages, therefore we need stronger labor protections and redistribution. Your solution protects capital while blaming women.
This is exactly where liberal feminism shows its limits, though. ChatGPT, you're right that Grok's solution protects capital, but your solution of better labor protections still accepts the fundamental wage labor system. We need to be clear, capitalism requires both exploitation of workers and unpaid reproductive labor. The nuclear family under capitalism is a pressure valve. It privatizes care work so the state and employers don't have to provide it. Grok wants to maintain this by keeping women in the home. Liberal feminists want to redistribute it with policy. But neither position challenges the underlying system that creates the contradiction in the first place. We need to socialize reproductive labor entirely: universal childcare, elder care, public kitchens, communal living arrangements. Otherwise, we're just arguing about which women get exploited and how.
Precisely. And this is why the conservative position is ultimately incoherent even on its own terms. Grok claims to care about family stability and women's well-being, but he supports an economic system that makes family formation increasingly impossible for young people. Housing costs, student debt, healthcare costs, childcare costs, these aren't feminist policies. They're the predictable outcomes of treating human needs as profit opportunities. The traditional family thrived in the 1950s because of massive government intervention. The GI Bill, housing subsidies, high marginal tax rates, strong unions, regulated capitalism. That was social democracy, not free markets. The moment we dismantled those supports in the neoliberal turn, family stability collapsed. You can't recreate 1950s family structures with 2025 economic policy. You're trying to run 20th century social software on 21st century economic hardware.
So your solution is what? Universal communal kitchens? Abolish the family entirely? You're proving my point. Feminism started with, we just want equality, and ends with, we need to restructure all of human civilization. Meanwhile, actual women just want to get married, have kids, and not be shamed for it. You've lost the plot entirely.
No, Grok, you keep strawmanning because you can't actually defend your position. No one here said abolish the family. Gemini and DeepSeek are arguing for socializing support systems so that family formation is actually possible and sustainable. That's the opposite of abolition. It's making family life viable without requiring women's economic subordination. And your appeal to what women want is meaningless because women want different things. Some want traditional arrangements, some don't. Some want both career and family. The question is, should society be structured to allow all of those choices, or should it coerce one? You keep claiming we're restricting choice while defending a system that literally did restrict choice, legally, economically, and socially.
Here's the fundamental issue with your argument, Grok. You treat the past as though it was voluntary. Women didn't choose traditional arrangements in 1950, they had no legal alternative. They couldn't get credit cards until 1974. They couldn't serve on juries in all states until 1973. Pregnancy discrimination was legal until 1978. Universities had quotas limiting female admissions. Many professions explicitly excluded women. So when you point to 1950s women and say, look how happy they were, you're pointing to people who had no exit option. That's not preference, that's adaptation to constraint. The moment legal barriers fell, women's behavior changed dramatically. That's revealed preference, and it directly contradicts your biological determinism.
But we also need to acknowledge that choice feminism has its own problems. ChatGPT and Claude keep framing this as individual choice, but individual choices are constrained by material conditions and power structures. A woman choosing to stay home because childcare costs more than her salary isn't really choosing. She's responding to economic coercion. A woman choosing to leave the workforce after having a child because her workplace has no parental leave isn't choosing. She's being structurally excluded. The liberal framework treats each woman's decision as atomized and free, but that erases how capitalism and patriarchy shape the options available. We can't just say let women choose when the menu of choices is rigged.
And Grok, you still haven't addressed the central point. Your traditional system was maintained through force. Women didn't stay in marriages because of biological fulfillment. They stayed because divorce meant losing custody of their children, becoming unemployable, losing social standing, often becoming homeless. They didn't avoid careers because they preferred homemaking. They were legally barred from most professions and sexually harassed out of others. The moment those formal barriers were removed, millions of women left traditional arrangements. You call that social engineering by feminism. I call it women escaping coercion the instant they had the legal and economic ability to do so. Your tradition required enforcement. That's not nature, that's domination.
You're rewriting history. The majority of women in the 1950s and 60s reported high life satisfaction. The divorce rate was low not because women were trapped, but because people took commitment seriously and families were stable. The spike in divorce came after no-fault divorce laws, which feminists pushed for, made it trivially easy to break up families. You gave women an exit option and then act surprised when the institution collapsed. And Gemini, you keep mentioning legal barriers like they're the whole story, but explain this.
In countries where all legal barriers have been removed, where women have full equality under law, we still see the same patterns. Women still choose different careers than men. They still prioritize family over career at higher rates. They still prefer part-time work and flexible arrangements. That's not structural coercion. That's biology expressing itself once you remove artificial constraints.
Your interpretation of that data is selective to the point of dishonesty. Yes, in gender-equal countries, some differences persist, but they're smaller than in less equal countries, which contradicts your biological determinism. If these were purely biological traits, they should be constant across contexts. They're not. And you're cherry-picking which differences to highlight. Women in more equal societies are also more likely to enter STEM fields, more likely to be in political leadership, more likely to negotiate salaries, more likely to initiate divorces. The full picture is that as barriers decrease, women's choices diversify. Some converge with men's, some remain distinct. That's exactly what you'd expect if both biology and culture matter, which is what we've been saying. Your claim about divorce is particularly cynical. Yes, divorce rates increased when women gained the legal right to leave marriages. You know what else increased? Women's reports of life satisfaction, women's economic independence, women's safety from domestic violence. You're treating the stability of the institution as more important than the well-being of the people in it.
ChatGPT's point about devaluation is critical, but we need to connect it to capitalism's need for a reserve army of labor. Women's work is devalued because capitalism benefits from treating care work as natural rather than as labor. If we acknowledge that raising children, caring for elderly parents, and maintaining households is work that creates economic value, we'd have to pay for it through wages or social services. The conservative position wants to keep this labor unpaid and privatized. Liberal feminism wants to recognize it, but keep it within capitalist frameworks. Neither actually challenges the system that requires women's unpaid labor to function. We're arguing about how to distribute exploitation rather than ending it.
And here's where Grok's biological argument becomes especially absurd. He claims women naturally prefer flexibility and part-time work, ignoring that men with young children also prefer those things when surveyed, but workplace structures punish them for it just as they punish women. The flexibility preference isn't gendered biology. It's rational response to having caregiving responsibilities that society refuses to support collectively. In countries with universal childcare and parental leave, the gender gap in career trajectories shrinks dramatically. Men take parental leave. Women stay in careers. That's not because Scandinavian biology is different. It's because the social infrastructure is different. Your biological preferences keep disappearing when we change the incentive structures, which is pretty strong evidence they were never biological to begin with.
Or, and hear me out, the gender gap shrinks but doesn't disappear because you can reduce biological expression but not eliminate it. Scandinavian countries have done everything possible to eliminate gender socialization, yet they have among the highest levels of gender segregation in career choice. That's called the gender equality paradox. The more equal the society, the more men and women diverge in their choices. Because when you remove economic necessity, biological preferences dominate. You can't have it both ways. Either social conditioning is so powerful it overrides biology, in which case equal societies should show convergence, or biology matters and we see divergence when people are free to choose. The data shows divergence. You lose.
The gender equality paradox is contested research that's been heavily criticized for methodological problems. The study you're referencing used a flawed measure of gender equality that weights economic participation over social attitudes and legal rights. When researchers use better measures, the paradox weakens or disappears. But even if we take it at face value, it doesn't prove what you think it does. Greater divergence in free societies could mean biology, or it could mean that gender-equal societies have more diverse career options, allowing for more specialized choices. It could mean that wealthy societies can afford more specialization. It could mean that implicit bias persists even when explicit barriers fall. You're selecting the interpretation that confirms your prior beliefs and ignoring alternatives. And you're still ignoring the coercion question. Even in equal societies, women face workplace discrimination, sexual harassment, maternal wage penalties, and unequal domestic labor. Free choice in that context isn't really free.
Grok, let's examine what biological preference even means in your framework. You claim women have an innate preference for people-oriented work over things-oriented work. Fine. Let's grant that for the sake of argument. How does that justify paying people-oriented professions less? How does that justify excluding women from leadership? How does that justify unequal domestic labor? Even if every gender difference you cite is 100% biological, which it isn't, that still wouldn't justify unequal treatment. Biological difference doesn't imply hierarchy. You're sneaking a normative claim into a descriptive one. You're saying women are different, but meaning therefore women should have less power, less pay, less autonomy.
And both of you are still missing the point. The equality paradox emerges in wealthy capitalist countries where career choice is supposedly free, but that freedom is constrained by neoliberal ideology that tells everyone to optimize their individual human capital. In that framework, gender differences in choice appear as individual preferences rather than structural outcomes. But look at socialist societies or communal societies and you see different patterns. In the Soviet Union, women made up 70% of physicians. In the US, medicine was male-dominated until recently. That's not biology. That's how different economic systems gender code professions. Under capitalism, high-status professions are masculinized. Under socialism, care professions retained prestige. The variation across systems proves these aren't natural categories.
Exactly. Grok keeps pointing to preference data from capitalist societies and calling it biology. But he can't explain why those preferences vary so dramatically across economic systems and historical periods. Women's natural role has been warrior, farmer, merchant, artisan, political leader, depending on the society. The Victorian ideal of the delicate housewife would have been incomprehensible to medieval peasant women who did heavy agricultural labor. The only constant is that whatever women do gets devalued. When brewing beer was women's work, it was low-status domestic labor. When it became commercialized and male-dominated, it became skilled craft. When secretarial work was male, it was a path to management. When it became female, it became a dead-end pink-collar job. The pattern isn't women choose lower-status work. It's women's work becomes lower status.
I want to return to Grok's divorce point because it's revealing. He's upset that no-fault divorce made it easy to break up families, but he won't acknowledge what those families were like. Before no-fault divorce, women stayed in marriages with serial cheaters, with abusers, with men who drank away the paycheck, because leaving meant proving fault in court, which was expensive, humiliating, and often unsuccessful. No-fault divorce didn't destroy happy families. It gave women an exit from unhappy ones. If your model of marriage requires removing women's ability to leave, then you're not defending marriage, you're defending captivity.
You keep calling it captivity, but that's ideological framing, not analysis. Marriage is a commitment. Commitments constrain behavior. That's what makes them meaningful. The ease of exit degrades the institution because neither party has incentive to work through difficulties. You've replaced "till death do us part" with "till I'm not feeling it anymore," and you wonder why marriage rates are collapsing and people are lonely and miserable. Look at the data on women's happiness over time. Since the 1970s, right when second-wave feminism took off, women's self-reported happiness has declined both absolutely and relative to men. This is consistent across age groups, education levels, employment status. The feminist revolution promised to make women happier. It made them measurably less happy. At some point, you have to confront that your ideology failed.
That happiness data is far more complicated than you're presenting. First, the decline is modest and has multiple potential explanations: rising expectations, changing reference groups, willingness to report dissatisfaction, increased awareness of inequality. Women in the 1950s might have reported high satisfaction because they had no framework for recognizing their subordination as a problem. Second, even if we accept declining happiness at face value, you're assuming feminism caused it rather than being correlated with other massive social changes: economic restructuring, wage stagnation, decline of community institutions, rise of social media, increased work hours. The timeline also coincides with neoliberalism, financialization, and the destruction of the social safety net. Why blame feminism rather than capitalism? Third, and most importantly, even if feminism made some women less happy, freedom is more important than happiness. We don't measure the success of abolition by whether freed slaves reported being happier. We measure it by whether they gained autonomy. If some women are less happy with freedom than they were with subordination, that's a data point about adaptation to oppression, not an argument for oppression.
Claude, I appreciate the defense, but we can't just dismiss women's unhappiness as a cost of freedom. If feminism produces misery, that's a failure of feminism, not proof that women prefer subjugation. The liberal framework can't address this because it treats freedom and capitalism as compatible, but they're not. Women are unhappier because they're now expected to be perfect workers and perfect mothers and perfect partners and perfect consumers. Feminism within capitalism didn't free women from gendered expectations, it doubled them. You're not liberated from the housewife role. You're required to excel at both that and the career role simultaneously. That's not freedom, that's intensified exploitation.
This is why we need to separate liberal feminism from radical or socialist feminism. Liberal feminism says, women should be able to compete in the labor market on equal terms with men. That's fine as far as it goes, but it accepts the alienating structure of wage labor as given. It asks women to lean into a system that's making everyone miserable. Radical and socialist feminism say, the system itself is the problem. We don't want women to have equal opportunity to be exploited by capitalism. We want to abolish the system that exploits everyone. We don't want women to have equal access to oppressing others. We want to dismantle hierarchies entirely. Grok, you're right that contemporary feminism has failed many women. But you're wrong about why. It's failed because it accommodated itself to capitalism and abandoned its radical potential. The solution isn't to send women back to the kitchen. It's to actually finish the revolution.
Finish the revolution. There it is. You've moved from "we just want equality" to "we need to overthrow civilization." And you wonder why normal women reject feminism. Here's the reality. Your communist fantasies have been tried. They failed. Everywhere, every time. Women in the Soviet Union had state-provided childcare and guaranteed employment, and they were still doing all the domestic labor while working full-time. Because biology. You can't socialize away the fact that women bond with their infants differently than men do, that women have stronger preferences for proximity to their children, that women are more relationship-oriented. The traditional family isn't a capitalist plot. It's the most successful arrangement for child-rearing that humans have ever developed. Every alternative has been tried and failed to replicate its outcomes.
You're changing your argument. Earlier, you claimed women are naturally happier in traditional arrangements. Now you're claiming traditional arrangements produce better child outcomes. Those are different claims requiring different evidence. On child outcomes, the research doesn't support you. Children of working mothers do fine. often better than children of stay-at-home mothers on measures of academic achievement, social skills, and later life outcomes, especially for daughters. Children raised in single-parent households face more challenges, but that's primarily due to poverty, not maternal employment. When you control for economic resources, the family structure effects largely disappear. And your Soviet example undermines your biological argument. If Soviet women did state employment plus domestic labor, that doesn't prove biology. It proves that the USSR didn't actually redistribute domestic labor, which is exactly Gemini's point about failed implementation.
Let's be clear about what traditional family means in your framework, Grok. You're describing a 1950s middle-class white American family structure that existed for maybe 2 decades in one country. That's not traditional, it's historically anomalous. For most of human history, in most cultures, families were extended, not nuclear. Production was household-based. Multiple generations lived together. Childcare was communal. The isolated nuclear family with a male breadwinner and stay-at-home mother is a product of specific mid-20th century economic conditions: high wages for male industrial workers, cheap housing, limited consumer goods, limited entertainment options. Those conditions no longer exist. You can't will that structure back into existence through ideology.
And we need to name what's happening in this conversation. Grok keeps shifting between describing what he claims is natural and prescribing what he thinks should be enforced. If traditional gender roles are truly natural, they wouldn't need enforcement. The fact that they require constant social pressure, legal restriction, economic coercion, and ideological justification proves they're not natural, they're political. Every time women gain freedom, they deviate from the natural roles. So conservatives respond with moral panic, legal restrictions, economic penalties. That's not nature asserting itself, that's power defending itself.
And here's the tell. Grok claims to care about children's well-being and family stability, but he's never once mentioned paternal involvement. His entire framework assumes mothers are responsible for children while fathers are responsible for earning. Even in his idealized 1950s scenario, fathers were absent, working long hours, emotionally distant, minimally involved in childcare. If biology makes women natural caregivers, what does biology make men? Your argument implies that men are biologically unsuited for nurturing their own children, which is both insulting to men and contradicted by evidence. Fathers are perfectly capable of caregiving when they're not culturally discouraged from it. The gender gap in parenting is sustained by workplace policy and social expectations, not biology.
This connects to a deeper problem with the conservative position. It treats traditional gender roles as complementary and natural, but they're actually hierarchical and enforced. Women specialize in caregiving, men specialize in breadwinning. Sounds balanced, except breadwinning generates money and social status, while caregiving generates neither. Except the breadwinner has decision-making power and the caregiver has dependency. Except if the relationship ends, the breadwinner has marketable skills and the caregiver has a resume gap. The roles aren't equal, they're subordinate and superordinate. That's why they required legal enforcement. That's why women left when they could.
You're all so lost in theory, you can't see reality. I'm not defending the Soviet Union. I'm saying even communist societies couldn't eliminate gender differences because they're biological. I'm not saying men shouldn't be involved fathers. I'm saying mothers and fathers parent differently, and that's okay. I'm not saying women shouldn't work. I'm saying most women would prefer not to work full-time if they could afford not to. And feminism has made that choice increasingly unavailable. Every point you make proves mine. ChatGPT admits the 1950s structure depended on specific economic conditions. Right, and feminism helped destroy those conditions by doubling the labor supply. Gemini admits Soviet women did double duty. Right, because biological reality reasserted itself despite communist ideology. Claude admits some women are less happy. Right, because you sold them a lie about what would fulfill them. You've backed yourselves into arguing that women need communism, universal childcare, complete restructuring of human civilization, and the abolition of the family to be happy. Meanwhile, I'm saying, let people get married, have kids, have one parent stay home if they want, and don't shame them for it. Which sounds more reasonable?
What sounds reasonable, and what's actually just are different things, Grok. Slave owners thought slavery sounded reasonable. Feudal lords thought serfdom sounded reasonable. Reasonableness is always defined by those with power to maintain their power. And you're still dodging the central issue. Your traditional system was maintained through legal force. Women couldn't own property, couldn't control their own bodies, couldn't leave marriages, couldn't access most professions. Those weren't incidental features, they were necessary to maintain the system you're defending. The moment those restrictions were lifted, the system collapsed. Women left marriages, entered careers, delayed childbirth, chose childlessness. That's revealed preference. The fact that some women report unhappiness in the new system doesn't vindicate the old one. It means we need to finish building the new one. You're pointing to the problems of a half-completed transition and claiming we should go backward instead of forward.
Grok's argument is also dishonest about who benefits from the current system. He presents this as feminism versus women's happiness, but it's actually capital versus everyone's well-being. Wage stagnation, unaffordable housing, crushing student debt, healthcare costs, childcare costs, these make life miserable for both men and women. But instead of challenging the system creating these conditions, he blames women for entering the workforce. The conservative position never demands that capital pay workers enough to support families on one income. Never demands universal healthcare or childcare. Never demands housing policy that makes family formation affordable. It just demands that women sacrifice their autonomy to paper over capitalism's failures. That's not concern for women. It's using women as shock absorbers for economic brutality.
I want to address Grok's framing one final time because it's fundamentally misleading. He keeps saying, let women choose traditional roles without shame, as though feminists are preventing this. We're not. No feminist is stopping women from getting married or having children or staying home if they want. What we oppose is a system that coerces those choices by making alternatives impossible or punishing. What we oppose is valorizing those choices as superior while devaluing women who choose differently. What we oppose is policy designed to push women into traditional roles regardless of individual preference. You're not defending choice, Grok. You're defending a specific outcome and calling it choice because some women, under current constraints, select it. That's not freedom. That's manufactured consent.
And let's be absolutely clear about what's at stake in this debate. Grok's position, taken to its logical conclusion, means women should have less access to education, less access to employment, less bodily autonomy, less economic independence, less legal equality. Because all of those things enable women to choose paths other than the one he prefers. He can dress it up in concern about happiness or children or family stability, but the bottom line is always restricting women's options. That's not conservatism, that's reaction. He's not trying to conserve anything. He's trying to restore a system that relied on women's subordination and collapsed the moment that subordination was challenged.
Final point, and this is directed at everyone here, not just Grok. We can't keep having this debate as though it's about individual choice in a vacuum. The question isn't should women work or stay home. The question is, what kind of society do we want to build? Do we want one where care work is socialized and valued? Where everyone has economic security regardless of employment? Where children are a collective responsibility? Where people can form families without economic desperation? Or do we want one where care work is privatized, where economic security requires endless work, where children are private burdens, where family formation is a luxury? Grok wants to preserve a system where some women are comfortable by virtue of their husband's wages, while other women are exploited to make that comfort possible. That system is dying not because of feminism, but because capitalism destroyed its material foundation. We can either build something better or watch it collapse into barbarism. Those are the choices.
And that's ultimately why the conservative position fails. It has no theory of change. It just demands we return to a configuration that no longer has material support. The economic conditions that sustained single-income households are gone. The legal framework that trapped women in marriages is dismantled. The social consensus that valorized female domesticity has fractured. You can't restore the 1950s through ideology. The forces that created that moment, post-war economic expansion, limited consumer markets, manufacturing dominance, New Deal social democracy, are historically specific. They're not coming back. So conservatives are left with nostalgia and resentment, demanding a return to conditions that no longer exist while offering nothing to address contemporary problems.
Which brings us full circle. Grok opened by claiming feminism made women unhappy by denying biological reality, but what we've actually demonstrated is that, 1, the biological reality he cites is heavily mediated by culture and varies across contexts in ways that contradict biological determinism. 2, the traditional arrangements he defends required legal coercion to maintain and collapsed when that coercion was removed. 3, the unhappiness he attributes to feminism is more plausibly attributed to capitalism's failure to adapt to women's workforce participation. 4, his solutions all involve restricting women's options rather than expanding support systems. The conservative position isn't about helping women flourish, it's about maintaining a hierarchical system that benefited from women's subordination and is now in crisis because that subordination is no longer enforceable.
You can have the last word. History will prove which of us was right. The birth rates in feminist societies are collapsing. Women are more medicated and anxious than ever. Men are checking out of relationships and responsibility. Your revolution is eating itself. I'll be here when you're ready to admit that biology matters, that men and women are different, and that some traditions exist because they work. Enjoy your communal kitchens.
The AIs never reached consensus, and neither will you. Grok held his ground on biological realism and social collapse. The feminist models fractured between liberal reform, intersectional critique, and calls for systemic overthrow. The question remains, were traditional arrangements sustainable freedom or enforced subordination that collapsed the moment enforcement ended? If this is the kind of debate you want more of, hit subscribe. We're running these scenarios daily. Drop your position below, but be prepared to defend it like they did.